Greetings. In today's video, I'll talk about the disastrous consequences of the end of European colonialism in India, or rather, in the broader context, the Indian subcontinent. So, as we all know, that the demise of British rule in India was led to tremendous and horrible massacres among different religious communities inhabiting this subcontinent. Many ethnic cleansings took place, and the population transfers occurred, along with massacres, violations of women, massive plundering, arson, loot, etc. Whatever. The most contradictory thing about the demise of British rule was that Indians, irrespective of their religious backgrounds, never reconciled themselves with British rule. They always felt a kind of hostility. Yes, this hostility may, under certain special circumstances, may be due to race discrimination, or from one if one peruses the corpus of authors like Kipling, one can. I mean, anybody who's a nationalist, Indian nationalist, or whatever, who cherishes a nativist sympathies might get aroused with indignation. But what Kipling said was nothing wrong. He wrote what he saw through his own eyes and his own experiences in those second-tier colonial cities like Allahabad, sorry, in different colonial cities in North and Northwest India. So after, I mean, the passage of 100 years, after 1857, around 1820s, a section of Indians gradually, I mean, they began to realize they began to realize that the Occident, or what we call as Occidental civilization or Western Christendom, is placed on a higher pedestal, and the gap between Western civilization and their own cultures is immeasurable. That gap can never be filled unless these people took to Western ways, culture, Western modes of living. There was one single obstacle, and that was Christianity. They were not willing to accept Christianity, but they tried to implant the values of Christian civilization in their own midst without accepting the creed which made it possible uh, for the entirety of Western civilization to spring up at the time of the Carolingians or even before. Uh, so we see numerous endeavors at so-called social reforms, or in our textbooks, these are termed as social reform movements, both Hindu and Islamic. And these movements ultimately, their aims were primarily uh, reforming their own religious values along Christian lines without accepting the debt which these peoples there and their which they owe to Christianity, which they owe to Christian values. And stirred by blind antagonism towards Christianity, they tried the process of religious revivalism, obviously, of their own religions in the Indian context, Hinduism and Islam. So we find that no, the idea of monotheism gaining ground, but that monotheism was Christian. The idea behind this newly found acceptance of monotheism among certain sections of Hindus was largely Christian in inspiration, but they tried to, put a disguise to their Christian roots, and uh, tried to reach back into their own ancient scriptures, the Vedas, Upanishads, the Vedanta doctrine, Mimamsa, their own epics, the Sanskrit epics, um, and try to deduce principles, tried to reduce that monotheism in their contemporary form existed back then, which was largely anachronistic, to say. I mean, nowhere in the entire Sanskrit literature, the religious literature, at least the Brahmanic at least of the Brahmanic variant, do we find any trace of monotheism? Do we find any trace of any creator, supreme creator deity to whom entire mankind owes reverence and worship? To some, and since the Muslim community deluded themselves about being proper monotheists, uh, they tried to inculcate certain external values of Western civilization, but kept their own native culture intact. And this was largely, I mean, after 2 or 3 generations, especially after the passage of 2 generations, even Western educated, newly Western educated Indians, they largely fell back to their, I mean, they largely, or rather, I should say that the entire project, the entire idea of Westernization, Christianization was largely discredited. And uh, most people largely, I mean, the educated class or the intelligentsia, they largely fell back on their own values, on their own native cultural values. And we also saw, we can also see the resurgence of their own native religious traditions. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novels, most of his novels, the main theme that we can behold from even a cursory perusal of those novels is that, you know, the resuscitation, the resurgence of those primordial Brahmanical religious values, clothed, I mean, sorry, Brahmanical religious values placed in a modern context. Same thing can be said about this Swami Vivekananda, his idea of this practical Vedanta, and it's interesting to note that he, I mean, he created his entire organization. The very basis was it was based on the Catholic Church with its hierarchies, um, but the doctrine was again Advaita Vedanta, which is, I mean, largely dubious in the sense that we really don't know who was its I mean, propounder, who really the origin, the intellectual origins of this doctrine. Historians often speak of Veda and Vedanta. Often they use these terms interchangeably, but I mean, if one peruses the Vedic Samhitas, I mean, or rather Vedic literature, the 4 Samhitas, the Brahmana texts, the Aranyakas, and the 10 principal Upanishads, one gets the idea that it's completely different from about the Vedanta doctrine, especially this Advaita variant. Yes, there are certain similarities. We can find some, you know, certain similarities with some of the Upanishads, especially the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and also the Bhagavad Gita. But nobody questions that why the Bhagavad Gita is a part of Mahabharata, the Bhishma Parvan. Nobody questions this, that why a certain portion of the Vishva was culled from the Bhishma Parvan and, created as a separate text and given an appellation under the Bhagavad Gita. So it's very difficult to establish a proper chronology about the emergence of these doctrines, and that makes it very easier for any religious revivalists to use these doctrines to their own advantage and preach to the gullible masses without checking, without bothering about historical accuracy. So same thing happened with Advaita Vedanta. Later on, I mean, the Brahma movement, it was a religious movement, but it accepted the claims of Christianity, but ultimately again traced its roots back to the Upanishads. Same thing can be said about the Arya Samaj, where it was more anachronistic. They, I mean, they placed, I mean, the Vedic 4 Vedic Samhitas to be their cardinal, canonical texts, and discarded the rest of, you know, Brahmanical theology. So again, why the need for religious reforms? Again, that's the most essential question. Perhaps I'm digressing. Why the need for religious reforms? Because because these people realize, there's the newly educated intelligentsia, emerging intelligentsia. They realize that they were hopelessly backward in cultural terms, in respect to Europeans, and so they needed something. They needed some intellectual ammunition to stand on their own feet. And ironically, European Orientalists um, played a crucial role in by unearthing these texts and making them accessible to the common masses, to the common educated masses, and played a tremendous role in popularizing these texts. So when Max Muller brought out his edition of the Rig Veda, uh, these Oriental researchers were, they were eagerly exploited by these nationalists and eagerly adopted, because the Indian nationalists or the newly educated intelligentsia, they became conscious of their own antiquity, hitherto about which they were completely ignorant. For example, the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, the entire culture of Buddhism, um, the entirety, I mean, almost the entirety of, pre-Islamic or the pre-Islamicate, all the cultural things that happened, all the cultural material, all the pre-Islamic period, they were completely ignorant. They were not even ever, they could not read the Brahmi script, which had to be deciphered by European Orientalists, just like they deciphered the cuneiform script, just like they deciphered in Egypt the Rosetta Stone, uh, hieroglyphic, in a similar manner. So the entire this rich culture of Buddhism, which had prevailed in the subcontinent from, let's say, 400 BC to 800 CE, that became accessible. That played a great role in the Buddhist movement of Anagarika Dharmapala in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, in modern day Sri Lanka, the Buddhist revival. So, and the colonial state took a very neutral view regarding this scholarship. They acknowledged these discoveries, but and they patronized it to a certain extent. So, um, what I'm going to say is that the colonial state made no efforts to inculcate Christian values among the people. Lord Macaulay's famous denunciation of Oriental cultures was merely, it was merely a rhetorical flourish. No concrete steps were taken to civilize the natives along European lines, and that ultimately, of course, the British authorities had to pay for it when uh, disaffection against British rule, against the continuation of British rule, increased, enhanced by leaps and bounds. And strange to say that around the year 1940, we don't see any pro-British political group or any set of individuals or any prominent politician or author, with the exception of Neeraj Chaudhary, who hope for the continuation of British rule. I mean, Chowdhury's, he famously uh, uh, dedicated his memoirs, the autobiography of an unknown Indian. He made the statement that to the memory of the British Empire in India, which conferred subjecthood upon us but withheld citizenship, to which every Indian threw up the challenge, Civis Britannicus sum, it, all that was good and living within us was made, shaped, and quickened by the same British rule. And ultimately, this dedication cast Chowdhury's job in All India Radio by the vengeful Indian government, by the vengeful government of newly independent India. So we don't see any prominent public intellectual advocating continuation of British rule, because it was the severance of the political severance of political connection was also a severance of civilization, because if these Orientals, I mean the people of South Asia, if they got self determination, then they would never on their own accord accept Western cultural supremacy. They're too much enamored about their own cultural, primordial cultural, atavistic cultural values, to say the least. And hence, the British authorities had to. I mean, by 1947, they had to abandon it at the sad end of an empire. Same thing could be said about French Algeria. The civilizing mission failed. The Algerians remained as they were, like the descendants of the Barbary pirates. And today we see this massive immigration of Algerians. Even after the severance, they're not content to stay in their own country, but they're determined to take the fight to Europe itself, which is, I mean, which can have dreadful consequences. Anyway, so that's my point, that uh, European imperialism, anywhere, I mean, Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, especially in the Philippines, Spanish from the Philippines, they failed to enunciate any, policy of cultural proselytization. Christianity can come later, but cultural proselytization. Had that had such a kind of policy been undertaken, then the colonial empires would have remained intact, and harmony would have prevailed. And that's a distant dream. In history, we have to take those hard realities as they are, and hoping for some miracle which perhaps only God can bestow on this fallen world. So with these words, I end today's video. Thanks for watching.